Welcome everyone to Meet the Lichens episode 3. Today we have 4 new lichens, and I promise that all 4 of them are quite distinctive from one another, and that 2 of them aren't both yellow-green things that look almost identical like last week. But first, a quick review quiz. First of all, you should be able to identify 2 different genera on the twigs here, at least be able to guess what they might be. What are they? Take a second to think about your answers. Okay, next up, what is this? You should be able to make out distinct whitish and greenish sides. Alright, and one more. What is this hairy lichen with round branches and with Dr. Seuss-like apothecia? Okay, if you guessed Xanthoria and Flavopunctilia or maybe Flavoparmelia for the first photo, then Avernia, Prunastri in the middle, and then Usnea on that last one, you are right. Okay, so this week we have 4 new lichen genera, but we'll also go more into depth on a particular species of our first genus. These are all fairly common in the Bay Area parks like last week's set, though they're a little more sensitive to their environment and less pollution tolerant than the last set. Here we go. This episode is a little more California focused than the previous one, but still all of the genera are common much more widely. First up is the genus Ramalina. If you watched the previous episode, you may recognize it as a lookalike for Avernia. Like Avernia, Ramalina has flattened lobes and a pale yellow-green color, and many genera are small and shrubby, sort of like Avernia. But Ramalinas are true fruticose lichens. The 2 sides of their lobes are indistinguishable from one another. They have the same color, same texture, no structures that distinguish the top from the bottom, as it would in Avernia. Ramalinas are sometimes called strap lichens, with the lobes described as strap-like, and the branches can be quite stiff, and certainly stiffer than Avernia. Ramalina as a genus is a bit like Usnea in that some are small and tufted or shrubby, and others can be quite long and pendulous, as we'll see in a little bit. Some species or individuals can have very wide, flat lobes, while others are a little narrower and not quite as flattened. So there's a lot of variation. Some species have serratia, others have apothecia, usually one or the other, but occasionally both. The apothecia are mostly cup-shaped, as is pictured in this slide, and if it has serratia, they're often clustered into distinct serralia, which you can see on the picture on the next slide. Ramalina is similar to many genera in that you'll often have 2 species where the main distinguishing factor is whether it is fertile, that's with sexual structures, usually apothecia, or not, with only asexual structures like serratia. Ramalinas mostly live on bark, though there are a few species that prefer rocks. Also, over on this slide, note the serralia, the little clusters of serratia on the specimen in this picture here. Okay, on to lookalikes. So we're going to focus first here on the shrubby species, since the shape can really determine the lookalikes in this genus. We're going to talk about a pendulous Ramalina shortly. So Avernia, of course, is a lookalike, but it's flimsier and has 2 sides that are slightly different colors. Niebla is another possible lookalike if you're in a foggy coastal area. Niebla even has a thicker and tougher cortex than Ramalina, but they're mostly on rocks, while Ramalinas are mostly on bark. And Nieblas often also have little dark dots called pycnidia. And then in the middle there, tufty Usneas could also be a lookalike for a beginner, especially since they often grow side by side with tufty Ramalinas. But you should know from the last episode that Usneas have round branches, not flattened, and they have a distinctive central cord, which Ramalinas do not have. Okay, before moving on to another genus, we'll do a quick focus on a particularly special pendulous Ramalina species, Ramalina menziesii, also known as lace lichen. Ramalina menziesii is special because it's our state lichen here in California. It became the state lichen in 2016, and it is, as far as I know, the only state lichen still. However, the Canadian Museum of Nature just held a vote last year for the Canadian national lichen. Ramalina menziesii can be very big, up to a meter long. It's distinguished from other Ramalina species and other lichens by its distinctive nets. It's the only species in North America that has these nets. And lace lichen can be variable in form, but it always has these nets somewhere. Lace lichen, as I said, can get really big and can form huge masses in California oak woodlands, like in this picture. And it's an important food for deer in these habitats and can play a substantial role in nutrient cycling where it's common, like in these habitats. So, lace lichen lookalikes. The nets on lace lichen are pretty distinctive, but you might confuse small specimens with other Ramalina species, which will have similar strappy green lobes. But if you look for those nets, they'll be distinctive. And other species of Ramalina tend to be smaller and shrubbier, less hairy. And from a distance, you might also confuse lace lichen with Pendulous usnea species, like the one in the middle picture there, or perhaps Spanish moss, which is pictured on the right, because they both grow on trees in this similar draped way with just tons and tons of the stuff. But if you look closer, the nets will be really distinctive that it's lace lichen, and the flattened lobes in Ramalina versus the round one usnea might also be helpful. There's also the fact of region where you are. So pendulous usneas tend to cover the trees further north than here in the northwest. So if you see something in the Bay Area draping the trees, it's most likely lace lichen. And Spanish moss, which is neither lichen nor moss, by the way, doesn't live in California. You'll really only find that in the southern United States. Next up is one of my favorite lichen groups, Hypogymnia, sometimes called tube lichens. Hypogymnia is a foliose lichen that may sometimes appear to be fruticose. Most species have these hollow, narrow, inflated-looking lobes, and if you cut one open, it'll be hollow inside, like you can see in that little picture on the bottom right. And the lobes are relatively narrow. And hypogymnia means naked underneath, which might either refer to this coloring, where it's white or green or pale gray on the top and dark below. It might also refer to the fact that it's hollow inside. And when you do break it open, the color inside, the ceiling inside the lobes might be brown or white, and that color can help you identify the species. Apothecia are common in hypogymnia. They're brown and cup-shaped, and the lobes are often dotted with pycnidia. And hypogymnias are mostly found on conifer bark or on shrubs, sometimes on soil. One Bay Area place where I've seen a lot of them is near the summit of Mount Diablo, so when that park reopens, it could be a good place to check it out. A fun fact if you're watching this as part of my Merritt College course, a Hypogymnia species is the symbol of the Merritt College Natural History program. The logo at the right there was drawn by Marianne King. And if you're watching this from elsewhere, take note, lichens make great mascots. So, hypogymnia lookalikes. Hypogymnia can be pretty variable, but the hollow lobes are pretty distinctive. You might confuse hypogymnia with a genus called menziesii, pictured on the left there, but that species has these openings in the upper lobe surface that look like these sort of little dots, like you can see in the picture there. You might also confuse it with some fischias or other narrow-lobed light-colored lichens that might look sort of inflated. But they do not have hollow lobes, so if you cut them open, you can tell that it's something different. And in a key, you might be thrown at first by Cladonia, because the key refers to hollow lichens, and Cladonia has hollow podicia, but that's pretty different than the hollow lobes of the hypogymnia, so the genera don't really look that much alike, and that shouldn't give you too much trouble. The next lichen genus of the day is Parmotrema. So Parmotrema is a foliose lichen. It's gray or blue-green in color, with broad lobes and often with very obvious cilia on the lobe margins. Parmotrema has a black lower surface or brownish lower surface with this lighter brown margin, and it can also have rounded cerealia at the margins, which you can make out if you look close in this slide. Parmotrema is common on bark all along the California coast. It's less common inland. And a fun fact about Parmotrema is that Parmotrema perlitum, which is the most common species around here, is also common elsewhere and is used as a spice in Indian food. It's called black stone flower, though of course it is not a flower at all. Parmotrema lookalikes include the flavos from last week, Flavoparmelia and Flavopunctilia, and several other light-colored, broad-lobed foliose lichens. But Parmotrema is more bluish than these. It's not so yellow, that yellow-green color of the flavos, and has a smoother surface, and it usually has those cilia, which other ones don't. You might also mix it up with a lichen like Parmelia, pictured on the right, but Parmelia has narrower lobes and often has cracks in its surface. So our final lichen group of the day is Cladonia. Cladonia is a big genus including lichens that generally take one of two forms: lichens with a squamulose base and distinct pedicia, or more shrubby, dichotomously branched reindeer moss types. This one in the photo is the first of those two. In the Bay Area of California, the squamulose kind with pedicia is much more common, but farther north and in many high-latitude places around the world, the branched reindeer moss type is much more common, covering huge swaths of land in Arctic regions. In the kind with distinct pedicia growing out of a squamulose base, the pedicia can look quite different depending on the species, as you'll notice looking at pictures of different Cladonias. Some are narrow with red apothecia, known as British soldiers sometimes. Some are cup-shaped, some are weird little stalks, but it's still fairly easy to recognize them as Cladonia because so few other lichen genera have anything quite like these pedicia. Cladonias usually live on soil or decaying wood, and you can often find them at the base of trees. So though they're not common in California, it's worth also knowing about the other group of Cladonias, which are sometimes grouped as Cladina today. And instead of that squamulose primary thallus with obvious individual pedicia, these lichens tend to look shrubby with pedicia that branch many times. They have a primary thallus, but you usually don't see it. It's crustose and usually pretty inconspicuous. In fact, I didn't know that existed until I started doing some research for this lecture. And these lichens are really common at high latitudes, and they play this very important role in boreal ecosystems, which we'll hear about in our ecology lectures. It's usually called reindeer moss, although of course it is not a moss at all. Usually Cladonias are pretty obvious, but there are a couple of Cladonia-like genera. So on the left there you can see Pylophorus, which has pretty similar pedicia, but they have these black apothecia, which Cladonias do not. And Pylophorus is also a lot less common than Cladonia is. And then on the right you can see these fruticose lichens like Stereocolon and Sphaerophorus, which may resemble the reindeer moss type of Cladonias, but they branch differently, they're on a smooth. And also these two are much more common in the Bay Area than any reindeer moss type species. So if you see something that looks like what's on the right there, and you are familiar with reindeer moss, know that if you're in the Bay Area, it's more likely to be something like Sphaerophorus than actually being a Cladonia. All right, that's it for this week. Let's review what we've done this week. So first of all, Ramalina the genus, fruticose, green with flattish, strappy lobes. Ramalina menziesii is lace lichen. It's a California state lichen. It has those distinctive nets. We've got Hypogymnia, which has hollow, inflated lobes. And then Parmotrema, which is a blue-green, often with cilia. And finally, Cladonia, which has two forms most of the time, the squamulose form with conspicuous pedicia, or more branched and shrubby like reindeer moss. All right, go forth and lichenize, and I'll see you next time.